Chicago in just the last few months. I was here in September speaking to Union Club and a number of other places. So it's great to be back in the Windy City. And thanks for that introduction, Bruce. And thank you for being willing to sit through my talk again. So I appreciate that. So, hey, one of the things that really gets me excited about history are all the new discoveries that keep popping up on a regular basis. For example, who knew that just a few years ago, we would find the bones of Richard III underneath a parking lot in the middle of England? Or that more recently, we would find an original parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence in a small courthouse, also in England. So even in the case of an iconic moment like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, there are still fresh discoveries and insights to be had. Now, as Bruce mentioned, many scholars know there are actually three featured speakers on November 19th, 1863. Edward Everett's 2-hour oration, which he delivered from memory, has basically been forgotten amid this huge shadow that's been cast by Lincoln's immortal 2-minute address. While Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, all the important dignitaries attended the third speech of the day at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church later that afternoon. Now, unlike Everett's speech, which was distributed to all the loyal newspapers in advance, this speech was never published and has remained lost to history for nearly 150 years. I argue that to fully understand Lincoln's address, you really need to understand all three of these speeches as a rhetorical ensemble, if you will. The Gettysburg dedication was not only about honoring the Union dead. This was the most important political event for the Lincoln administration since the election of 1860. Now, it may surprise you that the man chosen to wrap up the day's events, Charles Anderson, was a lifelong political opponent of Lincoln. He was also a Texas slaveholder in 1861. So how this man ends up sharing the spotlight with Everett and Lincoln on such an important day in the middle of the Civil War is a story so unusual that one noted Lincoln scholar called it a Civil War Forrest Gump. So today what I'd like to do is share highlights of Anderson's incredible Odyssey throughout the Civil War. As Bruce mentioned, I'll talk about why I think the speech is important. But before I do any of that, I'd like to start with the discovery of the speech manuscript itself, because that story begins in a very unusual place. Yeah, okay, I know, I hit the wrong button. So, about 20 years ago, an anthropologist from Indiana University, his name is Rob Tolley, was conducting a mountaineering expedition in the Wind River mountain range, which is here, in Wyoming, outside of a little town called Pinedale. Anyone in the audience ever been to Pinedale, Wyoming? Okay, well then you have to take my word for it. This is in the middle of nowhere. So, after 3 weeks of eating nothing but freeze-dried food, these hardy explorers emerge from the wilderness with just one thought on their mind. Can you tell me what that is? Exactly. Who said steak? Exactly, Tom. Where can I find the best steak in town? And locals direct them to this guest ranch. It's called the Fort William Guest Ranch. It's about 6 miles outside of Pinedale. You go down this dirt road, you turn right at this farmer's field, you go through this cattle grate. It's impossible to find. But somehow they found it, and they met these fine folks. The man on the left is Bartley Skinner, happens to be the great-grandson of Charles Anderson, and his wife Rose, who is the mayor of Pinedale. So Rob and his students make annual expeditions to Wyoming and become quite close to the Skinners, almost like family. One day when Rob was there, 8 large cardboard boxes arrive via UPS, because as we know, UPS goes everywhere. Inside these boxes, let me tell you, is a historian's dream. Hundreds of personal letters, photographs, 3 diaries, Anderson's library with pencil notations in the margins of practically every volume. Everything you would want to have in order to tell the story of a man's life. So Bartley's eyesight was failing by this time, so he asked my friend Rob to take charge of these artifacts, identify them, and then prepare to donate them to various archives across the country. And that's when the anthropologist became the accidental historian. That's Rob. So Rob toiled for years trying to identify these items. We all know how easy it is to read 19th century handwriting. One item in particular really puzzled him, and it was this item here. It was only after he had arranged to donate this to the Ohio Historical Society that further research revealed that this indeed was the long missing third address at Gettysburg. So who was Charles Anderson? How in the heck does he end up at Gettysburg? Well, Anderson was the brother of someone you may have heard of. His name was Major Robert Anderson, who surrendered Fort Sumter. They were both the sons of someone you probably have never heard of. This man here, his name was Richard Clough Anderson. He was an important figure in the Revolutionary War, confidant of many important people, including Washington, as you can see, aide-de-camp to Lafayette. He was appointed surveyor of the bounty land grants for Ohio and Kentucky after the war. Now, he was about, I think, 26 or 27 years old at the start of the war, so he enlisted. He didn't even get married until the war was over, when he was 37 years old. Still managed to have 18 children. The last child born when he was 71 years old. This is usually when I get a little applause from the seniors in the audience. Yes, thank you very much. So Anderson was a slaveholder, a Kentucky slaveholder. His youngest son, Charles, moved to Ohio and attended Miami University. I'll be showing you several items that were found in the cardboard boxes, and this is another one. This happens to be now the earliest copy of a graduation speech in the collection of Miami University. So if there's one thing you need to know about Charles Anderson, is that there was nothing more important to him, and I mean nothing more important, than preserving the Union that his father had fought and bled for. So it was customary at that time for the top graduates to give a graduation speech to their peers. So when young Charles Anderson decides on a topic, he decides to make his topic a plea for the erection of a memorial to the nation's greatest hero. Now, who is the nation's greatest hero in 1833? Of course. Who said Jackson? No, it's Washington. So let me read you just a few little snippets from this 19-year-old whippersnapper's vision of what the Washington Monument ought to look like in his graduation speech. He said it should be, quote, simple, towering, sublime, and resemble, quote, the obelisks of fallen Egypt. Now, how did this mere lad envision the precise aspect of a monument that was not even designed for another 3 years? I don't know, but I have a theory. So Anderson's mother, her name was Sarah Marshall. She was the first cousin of someone you've probably heard of. His name was Chief Justice John Marshall. Chief Justice John Marshall just happened to be chairman of the design committee for the Washington Monument, which first met only 3 weeks before the Miami graduation. So, of course, I have no proof that Charles and Uncle John were sitting around the fireplace talking about the prospective Washington Monument, but it does show you how close these elite political circles were at the time. So Anderson stays in Ohio after graduation, becomes a successful attorney. By the way, he never wants to be an attorney. Sorry for the guys at the head table here, but he really wants to be a gentleman farmer. But he has a family to support. So he does become an attorney, a successful attorney in Dayton, Ohio, and he then is elected in the 1844 election. He is elected to the Ohio State Senate, where he serves one very short and stormy stint, and here's why. So the first thing he does in the Ohio State Senate, he gets up on the floor and he makes a major speech advocating that they do away with the black laws of Ohio. Now, if you're not familiar with the black laws, these are laws that are designed to circumscribe the behavior of free blacks in the northern border states. You had to have proof that you were not a slave. You would have to register your occupation. You would have a curfew, etc., etc. Frankly, all designed to discourage more blacks from settling in the neighborhood. This made him no friends with the Democrats, of course, and probably alienated half of the Whigs in his own party. Then in 1849, he gives another very unusual speech. And has anyone in the audience here read the book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel? Okay, yeah, a lot of people in my audiences have. So this is Guns, Germs, and Steel, 150 years ahead of its time. So you have to understand how unusual a position, how radical a position this would be for a white intellectual in 1849 to say that blacks are not genetically inferior. So Anderson's argument is pretty sophisticated. He says, well, if whites were destined to rule the world, this Anglo-Saxon race, then how do we explain ancient Egypt? How do we explain China, for example? So most of his friends and family just laughed this off, but this also shows you what an independent thinker this man was. So by the time he gives this speech, Anderson has moved to Cincinnati, the Queen City of the West. He's become an even more successful attorney. He builds this beautiful Italianate mansion at the corner of Pike and Fifth. If you're familiar with Cincinnati, this used to stand just about directly across from the present Procter & Gamble headquarters. It no longer stands. And things are going pretty well for Mr. Anderson, right? There's only one big problem. Anderson has asthma. There's no cure for asthma at this time. So when he's not out practicing law, or more likely out fishing somewhere, he spends a lot of time in bed reading and recuperating. And in 1857, he picks up a book by this man, Frederick Law Olmsted, who we all know is the father of American landscape architecture. What you may not know about Olmsted is before he had that gig, he was a newspaper correspondent documenting the slave economy in the South. Let me read you how Olmsted described the city of San Antonio. This is a town that another newspaper correspondent just a few years earlier had described as a, quote, dirty mud hole. But here's how Olmsted described San Antonio. He said, the San Antonio River is of a rich blue and pure as crystal. Its spring in a wooded glen north of town may be classed as the first water among the gems of the natural world. The river is of such incredible beauty that you cannot believe your eyes and almost shrink from sudden metamorphosis by invaded nymphdom. And Anderson, this intelligent attorney, buys this, lock, stock, and barrel. He abandons his law practice, sells that beautiful mansion, and moves to Texas in 1859. Exactly. So as we know in retrospect, this is terrible timing for a strong Union man to be moving to Texas. But at first, things seemed to be pretty good for Union men in Texas at this time. And don't let anyone tell you there were not a lot of Union supporters in Texas. For example, in August, so I think somebody said it, yeah, in August of 1859, Sam Houston is elected governor over a secessionist incumbent. However, in October of 1859, an event takes place which changes everything, and who can tell me what that is? Exactly. So if you look at diaries, private letters, newspaper accounts of this time, you can see a dramatic shift in public opinion in the southern states back towards disunion as a result of Brown's raid. So back home in Ohio, Charles's friends and family, they're politically very well connected. They know that he has made a terrible mistake by moving his family to Texas. So they arranged to have him nominated by the Buchanan administration for Assistant Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State at this time is rather ill, so this could be a really plum position. Anderson turns it down twice. Another rather bonehead move. In July of 1860, things get much worse. So Anderson owns 2 slaves. One of his slaves, a boy named Dan, is found murdered and dumped in the San Antonio River. Later that same month, temperatures in North Texas reach 110 degrees. Fires break out all over the place. Several towns practically burn to the ground. Newspaper editors blame these fires on a supposed conspiracy between blacks and abolitionists. And this creates a wave of violence that some historians have called the Texas Troubles. So the 1860 election comes along. Anderson decides to support John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts in the Constitutional Union Party. And here's what Anderson said about the 1860 election. Anything to defeat Lincoln and almost anything to defeat Breckinridge. Anderson feels like the election of either of these sectional candidates is a sure recipe for disaster, and disaster in Anderson's mind is disunion. So, of course, we know what happens. Lincoln is elected. News of Lincoln's election reaches San Antonio, which is on the frontier, on the edge of Indian country. The secessionists in town, the Knights of the Golden Circle crowd, they call for an immediate meeting in Alamo Square to talk about next steps in the wake of this momentous event. Anderson happens to be in town buying supplies on the day of the meeting, so his Union friends ask him to stay over and speak at this meeting. He's not on the agenda. He certainly has not prepared a speech, but he does speak, almost creates a riot. And Anderson's speech is, oh, excuse me, this is his house he builds in San Antonio. Yeah, still stands, private club. So Anderson does speak at this meeting. He gives a rousing defense of the Union. The incoming Lincoln administration picks it up, has it printed. 6,000 copies are wallpapered all over the North. And Anderson becomes a national figure really for the first time. Now, just 3 days after this Alamo meeting, in a move that was orchestrated by Secretary of War John Floyd, who some might call one of the great traitors in American history, this man on your right, General David Twiggs. He's a Georgia native with strong Southern sympathies, big slaveholder. He's living in quiet retirement in New Orleans. Well, Secretary of War Floyd asked Twiggs to retake command of the Department of Texas over this man in the middle, Robert E. Lee. Now, at this time, the man on the left, Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, commander of all U.S. forces, he has developed a plan which many of you have heard of. It's called the Anaconda Plan. If you haven't heard of it, this is a contingency plan in the event of a potential civil war where the Union would blockade the major ports, control the key waterways, split the prospective Confederacy in half. And so he's developed this secret plan, and he sends this plan to Charles Anderson. And he asks Anderson to share it with both Twiggs and Lee. Because at this point, we don't know where people's sympathies are going to lie. So Anderson gives the papers to Twiggs first, and here's what Twiggs says. "It is damn strange that General Scott should have sent the papers to you. I know General Scott fully believes that God had to spit on his hands to make Bob Lee and Bob Anderson, and you are Major Anderson's brother. When Anderson visits Lee to retrieve these same papers, Lee begs him not to have them published for fear that this might indicate that the government intended to take some type of preemptive military action against the South. It is also at this moment that Robert E. Lee decides to confide in Anderson before he had to anyone else that if Virginia secedes, he would go with his state." So in mid-January of 1861, Governor Houston summons Anderson to Austin. And he asks Anderson to take charge of all the federal arms and armaments of the state of Texas. Now, at this time, of course, the Southern governors are trying to gather these munitions. Militias are drilling. People are preparing for secession. There's quite a conspiracy going on here. And so Houston communicates to David Twiggs, and he says, okay, Twiggs, surrender these arms to Anderson. And Twiggs says, I have no orders from Washington to that effect. And of course, we know what happens, right? Texas secedes, and Twiggs surrenders U.S. forces to a band of approximately 1,000 armed Texas citizens on February 16th, 1861. This happens to be the same day that Robert E. Lee is returning from a remote outpost. So picture this. Lee is riding into town. He has no idea that essentially a military coup has just taken place. He's surrounded by the secessionists, and he's told that unless he resigns his commission immediately and joins this rebellion, he would not be allowed to ship his personal effects back to Virginia. Lee replies, he has no obligation to an illegal gang of revolutionaries, so he asks Anderson to take charge of these belongings until they could be shipped back east. So Anderson and Lee are walking to the commission merchant in San Antonio when Lee reiterates this decision he told Anderson about just a few weeks previous, and here's what Robert E. Lee said. I still think, as I told you and Dr. Edwards, that my loyalty to Virginia ought to take precedence over that which is due the federal government. I shall so report myself to Washington. If she stands by the old Union, then so will I. But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, then I will still follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, with my life. Now Anderson, this strong Union man and friend of Lee's, feels compelled to respond, and here's what Anderson says. The selection of the place in which we were born was not an act of our own volition. But when we took that oath of allegiance to our government, that was an act of manhood, and that oath we cannot break. Lee replies, I know you think and feel very differently, but I can't help it. These are my principles, and I must follow them. Those were the last words the two friends ever spoke to one another. So Anderson's brother Robert surrenders Fort Sumter in April. The war is on. By the summer of 1861, Anderson still is remaining in Texas, trying to help other Union men who are being tarred and feathered or worse. Well, fortunately for Anderson and his family, the Confederate government passes an act. This is called the Alien Enemy Act. And what this act says is it allows Union supporters in the southern states 90 days to get out of Dodge or be subject to persecution, arrest, or worse. So Anderson and his family, he has a wife and two daughters. They pack up all their belongings, coincidentally in James Longstreet's wagon because he's already left town. And they head out for Brownsville, Texas, where they intend to take a steamer back to safety in the north. They get 1 day out of town when they hear hoofbeats. This man on the left, Henry Eustace McCullough, he is the brother of the much better known Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin McCullough, who died at Pea Ridge. He has changed his mind. He's decided that Anderson is much too dangerous to be allowed to leave San Antonio. So he sends a detachment of 16 mounted soldiers to round up the family and drag them back to San Antonio. Now you can imagine how they're feeling. They've just bankrupted themselves by selling that mansion and all their stock at a tremendous loss. They've left all their friends. Now they're coming back. And for lack of a better term, imprison them in the Menger Hotel. Now, many of you have probably been to San Antonio. You've been to the Alamo, and you never went next door to this Menger Hotel. Well, shame on you. This is a beautiful hotel. It was built in 1859. This was where Teddy Roosevelt recruited some of his Rough Riders. So next time you're in San Antonio, you really should check it out. So they take all of Anderson's money, they take all of his papers, they interrogate him for 3 days, and then McCulloch comes to a decision. He's going to offer Anderson a parole of honor, right, as one gentleman to another. So if Anderson pledges that he will not take up arms against this new Confederacy and he won't skedaddle, then he'll be allowed certain freedom of movement. Well, here's what Anderson says to McCulloch's offer of a parole. I would not give my parole for 1 minute to save your soul from hell. McCulloch replies, well, then I will exercise all the kindness and courtesy I can do toward you safely, or that you in your evident desire to make yourself a martyr will permit. So McCulloch eventually decides that Anderson's family can indeed leave, but he's going to throw Anderson in a military prison east of town. So Anderson's wife and 2 daughters are given a military escort. They again pack up their belongings and they head for Brownsville, Texas. Meanwhile, Anderson's friends are trying to figure out how to spring him from the military prison. And let's be clear, escapes from military prisons early in the Civil War, a very common occurrence, right? These are tent camps on the outskirts of town. There's no stockade fencing here. And the whole story of Anderson's escape, which I had 3 diaries to work with, my favorite part of the book, much too long to tell here, but I'm going to give you a little teaser. There are 3 conspirators in this escape plan, all right? Conspirator number 1, a Union widow woman who barely knew the Andersons, had only met them a few weeks previous. She's really upset that her son has run off to Houston to join the Confederate Army. She is the one that actually devises this elaborate escape plan. Conspirator number 2, a Belgian astronomer, an abolitionist. He is certainly in the wrong place at the wrong time. Conspirator number 3, if you can believe it, is the first cousin of the commanding officer of the prison camp. So Anderson does escape. He travels 400 miles in 11 days just to get out of Texas by himself. You can imagine a network of Union safe houses where he could exchange his horse. So 400 miles in 11 days just to get out of Texas, an even longer journey through Mexico, reunites with his family in Veracruz. They do hop on a steamer through Havana, and they arrive in New York on December 30th, 1861, after nearly 3 months on the run. And Anderson gives an account of this escape to a packed house at Cooper Union, the same Cooper Union where Lincoln so famously spoke. And here's what the New York Times said about it, and I quote, among the most moving and romantic episodes of the war. So now both Charles and Robert Anderson are national heroes. But of course there's a problem. I mean, Anderson has bankrupted himself in Texas, so he has no money, no job. What is he going to do? Well, Ohio Governor David Todd has an idea. We'd like you to raise a regiment, Charles. He's 48 years old, but he does raise 929 men in 2 weeks. And on August 6, 1862, Anderson is appointed colonel and commander of the 93rd Ohio. This is another item we found in the cardboard boxes, and as you can see, this is all we have. This is a partial recruiting poster where they're trading on the now famous Anderson name as a recruiting device. So, of course, Anderson and his men have practically zero military training. They drill for precisely 1 week and are sent to the front in Kentucky. And unfortunately, Anderson and his regiment are at the focal point of the initial Confederate assault at the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee. So as many of you know, this is one of the bloodiest major battles of the war, over 24,000 casualties. Experts like Jim Lewis would call this perhaps a tactical draw, but a strategic victory for the Union because the Confederates do retreat out of Middle Tennessee. Anderson is wounded twice in this battle, makes a rather miraculous escape from death, and I certainly will not spoil that one for you. But here is another item that was found in cardboard boxes. This was buried in a middle of a letter at the Huntington Library. This, we believe, is now the earliest hand-drawn map of the Stones River battlefield, drawn by Anderson himself. It's reproduced in my book for the first time. Anderson was so kind to his future biographer, yours truly, that he actually drew little X marks and included in the legend precisely where he was wounded so I could tell the story properly. So, Anderson is, of course, he's recovering from his war wounds, right? He will always have asthma. Well, now he's contracted a slight case of typhoid. So he's forced to resign his commission, and again, he's out of a job, but not for long. This is not an item that was found in the cardboard boxes. This I purchased on eBay. And this CDV, I have not seen this image before or since, and it's my favorite picture of Anderson. So when I bought this image, I looked at it and I said, well, this is obvious what this is, right? This is Anderson in his uniform with a blanket. This is obviously Anderson in early 1863 recovering from his war wounds at Stones River, right? Well, take a look at this picture. So the more I looked at it, he's looking pretty hale and hearty in this photograph. So now I do not think this was taken in early 1863. I think this was a promotional photograph taken for his next little escapade. So as many of you know, even by the middle of 1862, public opinion here in the North is really divided. I mean, people are really tired of this war. We thought this was going to be a short conflict. Now, hundreds of thousands have been maimed and killed, and there's so much anti-war opinion that the Republicans take a trouncing in the midterm elections of 1862. And they take such a bad beating that they decide to abandon the Republican Party name. They form a coalition with war Democrats and rebrand themselves as the Union Party. Now, the Union Party has a big problem in Ohio. In 1863, here's the problem. All right, exactly. This man, Clement Vallandigham. So if you don't know this man, he was a lawyer and actually a friend of Anderson's early in his career. By this time, they're certainly not friends. So Vallandigham is the leader of the Copperheads, the peace advocates, and he is speaking out strongly against the war, discouraging enlistment, so much so that General Ambrose Burnside's, he of the enormous whiskers, he's running the Department of Ohio at the time. He decides, independently, to arrest Vallandigham in his night clothes, at home, at night. Put him before a military tribunal where he is convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Now, President Lincoln is none too happy with this situation because now Burnside has just created a huge martyr for the Peace Democrats. So Lincoln decides to commute his sentence on one condition, and that be that he be deposited on the other sides of the line in the Confederate states. Well, Vallandigham does not want to be in the Confederacy, and frankly, Jeff Davis wants nothing to do with this guy. He is poison. So Vallandigham makes his way to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he hops on a steamer and ends up in Canada. And it is in Canada where this convicted traitor is nominated overwhelmingly by the Ohio Democrats as their candidate for governor in 1863. Well, the Union Party needs to respond, and the Union Party responds by nominating a very well-respected man. His name was John Brough. He's a war Democrat, railroad executive. There's only one problem with Brough. His prosperity has so increased his waistline that he weighs now 400 pounds. He's in terrible health. He cannot go out and campaign for this office. So this unusual election is really an election that's played out by the candidates for lieutenant governor. And so the Democrats decide, since of course their candidate is in Canada, he can't even come into the country, the Democrats decide to nominate the tall, handsome Mexican-American war hero George Pugh as their candidate for lieutenant governor. The Union Party decides to nominate newly minted hero Charles Anderson as their candidate for lieutenant governor. And Anderson barnstorms all over Ohio. He gives, I think, 37 speeches in 43 days. The Union Party wins by over 100,000 votes. And Lincoln wires Ohio Governor David Todd, "Glory to God in the highest, Ohio has saved the Union." Now, at this time, all of these elections did not take place in November like they do now. So at this point, Pennsylvania has not voted, New York has not voted. So they asked Anderson to go out and campaign for other Union candidates in those states. He refuses. Here's what he says. See if this doesn't sound like 2016. "I am and expect to be neither a Republican nor a Democrat. The one is not better than the other." So this brings us to Gettysburg. This is a famous photograph of the Gettysburg National Cemetery under construction. So the Ohio delegation has decided to hold a political meeting on the afternoon following the cemetery dedication. And of course, Ohio in 1863, as it is today, a critical state in American electoral politics. Governor Todd needs a keynote speaker for this meeting, so he asked Anderson to be the keynote speaker at this rally, which would be attended by Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, all the important people. So this is a fiery political rally with content that is not appropriate for a battlefield dedication. So they decide to hold it at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. This is how it looked in 1863. It certainly doesn't look like that anymore. There's a much larger brick structure now built on that same location. There is a nice plaque in there that says Lincoln sat here. Of course, nothing about my man, Charles Anderson. So this is really supposed to be Anderson's big moment, right? Well, a 70-year-old farmer and self-made legend by the name of John Burns steals the show. So if you don't know the story of John Burns, this is supposedly the only man who stayed in Gettysburg to defend the town. He took down, I don't know, 3, 7, 14, who knows how many Confederate soldiers. The legend grows each time Burns tells the story himself. And so picture this. Here is Burns with his cane, literally arm in arm with Lincoln on one side and Seward on the other side, marching into this meeting, upstaging my man, Charles Anderson. But what we have now is Anderson's entire speech available for the first time. It's printed in an appendix in the back of my book. It is certainly not as fun reading as the rest of the book, but I think it's really interesting to talk about what Everett said and what Anderson said, because as was mentioned before, Bruce mentioned we know what Lincoln said because we all had to memorize it in school. So if you indulge me, I want to give you just a little bit of what Everett said and what Anderson said. And let's first talk about the Union debt. Here's what Edward Everett, the rock star of his day, the most famous orator in America, here's what Edward Everett said about the Union debt. "I feel as never before how truly it was said of old, that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country." Now, when Anderson talked about the dead, he really wanted revenge. Here's what Anderson said about the Union dead. "The dead must have justice at their own graves. Their blood cries out from all this beloved ground to all these heavens above, for God has heard that cry." Now, of the Southern people, here's what Edward Everett said about the Southern people. "There is no bitterness on the part of the masses. The weary masses of the Southern people are yearning to see their dear old flag again flying above their capitals." Now, Edward Everett is a really intelligent guy, but he's way up there in northern New England. Not so sure he's totally in touch with Southern public opinion at the time, but be that as it may, Anderson has a little bit different perspective on the Southern people, of which he is, of course, is a Southerner. He feels like the Southern people have been duped, and here's what he says. The wicked purposes of vile and desperate politician traitors have overruled the good dispositions and infatuated and misguided the honest impulses of the people. So clearly, Anderson is placing the blame for this disaster on the Southern leaders. So let's see what Edward Everett says about the Southern leaders. He is surprisingly conciliatory. And here's what Edward Everett says. There is no personal bitterness felt, even against them. They may live in safe obscurity beneath the shelter of a government they have sought to overthrow. Well, as you might guess by now, Anderson had a little bit different spin. He was pretty angry. Here's what Anderson said about the Southern leaders. Yet bloodier retribution awaits. Nay, now falls upon those wretched men, whose crime neither earth can hide nor the seas can cleanse. These men were cultured into morbid activities and pampered at last into insane, parasital, suicidal arrogance. So Anderson is really mocking these Southern conspirators as corrupt aristocrats who were, quote, born to the inheritance of unjust power, nurtured by the milk of slaves and slavery, rocked in their cradles by servile hands. Oh, by the way, Anderson, he was also rocked in his cradle by servile hands. So Anderson is taking direct aim at Lincoln's political enemies. And remember, the peace Democrats at this time are calling for an immediate armistice. Now, in Anderson's view, the mere suggestion that these two sections could exist in the future as separate nations with this long common border without ending up as two perpetually warring military regimes is just preposterous, right? The ensuing military republic in the North would only be slightly less evil than the existing military oligarchy in the Confederate States. The Democrats were also playing on racial fears that an immediate emancipation would deluge the North with a flood of blacks, lowering wages, creating a huge pauper class. Now, these fears were valid according to Anderson, but only if a separate slave nation was established alongside the free North. If slavery were abolished throughout the South, then presumably the blacks would have little reason to pick up and move north. Now, at this point, I think Anderson veers just a little bit off script. He admits that he, too, fears the prospect of thousands of blacks streaming into the cities and towns of the North. And here's what he says, and let me preface this by saying this is going to sound shocking to 21st century ears, but this is mainstream white border thinking in 1863. So here we go. So seriously, do I estimate these evils of such black immigration and colonization among us, that if all other causes of the war against the Southern Confederacy of slave states could be removed, I really do think that these dangers of having our land converted into a vast sewer for their overflowing filth would constitute a just and sufficient cause of war to the end of the century. So Anderson, like Lincoln earlier in his presidency, is favoring gradual emancipation. But let's face it, I mean, this is November of 1863, right? The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January. The horse has already left the barn here, and yet Anderson stands directly in front of Lincoln and says this: "It seems to me better for us to bear with slavery in its unquestionable constitutional rights than for us to press this cruel war for other ends of doubtful, perhaps vain benevolence." So to Anderson, this really is not a popular revolution from the ground up, right? This is a power grab by evil demagogues intent on disrupting God's plan for the nation. And to make this point, Anderson stands here at the lectern, and Lincoln is right where this young man is sitting right now, and here's what he says. Let them seize and destroy our national city, its wood into ashes, its marble into sand. Let them imprison, hang, burn our president, and all the heads and hands of the departments. Yet we are still a nation. Foreign monarchy must understand, domestic oligarchy must relearn that our national being flows on forever in a stream of moral principles and not through any chain of printed deeds or written charters. So I imagine Lincoln and his cabinet members may have been squirming in their pews as Anderson is painting this macabre scene, but the audience is cheering wildly. So near the end of the speech, I can also imagine perhaps Lincoln grinning when Anderson says this. Here then was the first and only fair trial of self-government, of a government of the people, for the people, ever made on earth. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So this famous phrasing from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is certainly not a Lincoln invention. It was used on several occasions, for example, by Daniel Webster in some of his speeches. It was probably invented by a transcendentalist preacher by the name of Theodore Parker. So, whereas Anderson is a lifelong political opponent of Lincoln, it has to give Lincoln some comfort that at least in terms of their dedication to preserving the Union, these two gentlemen are on exactly the same page. So the speech is a big hit. Lincoln and Seward congratulate Anderson on his fine effort. Anderson rides back on the train with a very ill Lincoln. And the Ohio delegation orders that this speech be printed. Never happened. Remember, Everett's speech, 2 hours long, distributed to all the loyal newspapers in advance. It takes up so much room in these papers, there is simply no room for Anderson's speech. And 30 years later, when all the Confederate Union veterans are getting together, making up and hugging and everything's good, the media asks Anderson to provide a copy of this speech. He can't find it. So this Gettysburg dedication was not only a memorial. This was a carefully crafted political event designed to help kick off Lincoln's 1864 re-election campaign. Never in the course of his presidency had Lincoln left Washington solely for the purpose of participating in a public event. Now, many of the key Union Party operatives were there too, giving impromptu speeches on the night before the dedication. Opposition newspapers chastised the president and his allies for turning a somber and solemn event into what the Ohio paper, The Crisis, called, quote, an insensate carnival. Now, to be fair, there was plenty of serenading, merrymaking, and drinking going on the night before this dedication. The Philadelphia Age cried that, quote, the country should blush with shame. These men meet to laugh and joke and electioneer with the wounded still groaning and the dead unburied. Now, despite these criticisms, Lincoln and his allies knew that this was an important political moment, and they were prepared to leverage it with as much dignity and grace as possible. So the three speeches on the day of the dedication operate as a rhetorical ensemble. In addition to their dedicatory purposes, each of these speeches has an express political purpose. So Everett's purpose, of course, is to educate his audience. If you've read his speech, it's a blow-by-blow description of the battle. They put off the whole ceremony for a month just so he could be the speaker. He interviews generals on both sides. So he clearly is focused on the past. Lincoln, of course, his purpose is to inspire his audience, to create this vision of what the renewed nation would look like. Anderson's purpose is to motivate, or I would say even agitate, his audience back into supporting Lincoln's war agenda at a time when many in the North were calling for an armistice. So we've honored the dead soldiers with Everett. We've painted this glorious picture of the future with Lincoln. Now we need to finish the job. So many of us have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, right? Yeah. Well, Everett runs on the ticket against Lincoln for president in 1860. And as you've heard, Anderson never supports the president politically, but Lincoln is quite comfortable in such an ensemble. And here's what Lincoln said. I am willing to receive any man or class of men who will help us even a little. So Lincoln is this master politician who, in this instance, is using both of these men to bookend his remarks so he can appear to rise above the political fray and speak from inspiration. Remember, Everett's comments about the South were awfully conciliatory. But what this does is this allows Lincoln to paint this picture of reunion with reconciliation. But as to the equally important task of actually winning the war, Lincoln, of course, is constrained by the solemn context of a cemetery dedication. Here are quotes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So Lincoln has to ask his audience to read between the lines when he says unfinished work, never mentions the Confederacy, or the great task remaining. So Lincoln asks his audience to take increased devotion to that cause. Then he leaves it for Anderson to really spell it out for them. So Lincoln's political allies knew exactly what they were getting when they chose Anderson to wrap up the day's events. And of course, Ohio's importance in the upcoming 1864 presidential election could not be overemphasized. So it's in Lincoln's best interest to court favor with as many Ohio politicians as he can find. Well, where else can Lincoln find a former slave owner and border state Union man who has escaped from a Confederate prison, been wounded on the battlefield, and then helped defeat the most notorious Copperhead in the North? But as you heard with his remarks on emancipation, this man Anderson, despite his impressive credentials, despite his powerful skills of oratory, he was really somewhat of a loose cannon. And Lincoln uses him, of course, after that Alamo speech. He uses him again at Gettysburg, but he soon distances himself from Anderson, and that is just fine with Anderson. So the 1864 election comes along. Here is Vallandigham sitting on the right. He actually writes the platform for the Democrats, calling the war a failure. This is a little problem for Little Mac, the Democratic candidate. So the 1864 election comes along, and Anderson is asked, of course, to go out and campaign for Lincoln. What do you think he says? That's right. Well, listen to what he says. As for Mr. Lincoln, he might well attempt to row up the Niagara chute in a particularly frail birch bark canoe with a particularly weak feather for a paddle, as to talk about abolishing slavery as a condition for reunion. It is a cruel duty to declare against my own political friends, but it is my duty. So let's fast forward to June of 1865. Big Governor John Brough is ambling across the Ohio State Yard when he trips, stumbles, falls, sprains his ankle, develops gangrene, and dies. Anderson becomes governor of Ohio, a job that I assure you he never aspired to. And in his brief stint as Ohio's chief executive, he does his best to alienate the few political friends he has by coming out strongly against giving blacks, or newly freed slaves, rather, the franchise. To top it all off, in the election canvass of 1866, when Anderson is again a private citizen, he lashes out at the radicals in the U.S. Congress, calling them traitors to their principles. He goes on to say that, quote, they fought a war while denying there was ever any secession, then passed laws and amendments while 11 of the 36 states were disqualified from participating. In following the lead of the Congress, they are plunging us into another civil war. And for this Southern man, I think he probably felt like Reconstruction was another Civil War. So, with the radicals in charge in basically a one-party system in the North, Anderson no longer feels comfortable in Ohio. He moves back to Kentucky, where he spends the last 30 years of his life fading into historical obscurity. But at Gettysburg, both Everett and Anderson have their last important moments, allowing Lincoln the statesman to inspire a nation, while Lincoln the politician assembles a winning coalition. Thank you. All right, so here's the commercial. I have books. I'll sign them over there so you can see me afterwards. But let's get to the questions because this is a very unusual man. So yes, David.
Yeah, two things.
Uh-huh.
First, his mother, when you said Sarah Marshall,
Sarah Marshall, right?
she would also have been related to General of the Army and Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense George Marshall.
Ah.
He was a relative of John Marshall.
Ah.
Two, in Dayton, Ohio, have they decided to forget about Clement Vallandigham?
Do you think they should put a monument up to him?
No, I don't know if there's any accounts he lived in, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you know, I am scheduled to speak in Dayton in May, and I'm really excited because I haven't spoken there yet. So it'd be interesting to see. I have been to Dayton, and I've you know, walked in the footsteps, and I haven't seen anything about Clement Vallandigham. In fact, I don't even remember any type of a. They have a lot of public informations, and I don't remember any public information signs talking about Vallandigham. So that's a great idea, and I will definitely check it out and see if they're telling that story, because it's a story that needs to be known, and it doesn't reflect well on Dayton, but I mean. You know, there was a lot of pro-Confederate activity in Dayton, a lot. So it was a copperhead city, frankly. Yes, ma'am.
At the beginning, you said he did not like Lincoln, he didn't like Breckinridge. Did you say anything about Douglas?
Well, no, I won't say that he didn't like Lincoln. In fact, when he first meets Lincoln, when he gives that speech at Cooper Union, he immediately goes to Washington and he debriefs with Winfield Scott and he debriefs with Lincoln. He meets Lincoln and McClellan, and his comments on Lincoln is, he is probably the most unreservedly honest man that I've ever met, and he was exceedingly impressed with McClellan. Of course, not as impressed as McClellan was with himself. But, and unfortunately, I have no letters. No, I take that back. There are some comments on Douglas, and I'd have to go back and look at them, but when he is in Texas, and things are starting to look like they're going to go the way they're going to go, he first was very much anti-Douglas, and then he starts to perhaps think of Douglas as a great man. I think he calls him a great man, and that perhaps Douglas would have been a better candidate than John Bell. So I do remember him saying that. So I'd forgotten about that. So thank you for that. Yeah, so thank you. Yes, Bruce.
Your illustration of the three different Gettysburg addresses almost makes it sound like they were coordinated together.
Right.
Is that an accident, or did the three of them have some sort of contact to say, okay, you take this area?
Great question.
Take that area?
Great question. So here's what I'm arguing, and here's what I'm not arguing. So I am arguing that Lincoln is taking advantage of this situation, right, that he finds himself in, because as you know, Anderson is invited by David Todd on October 27th, and Lincoln is invited by Wills formally on November 2nd. So I don't see any evidence of collaboration between Lincoln and Anderson in this. In fact, on the contrary, I don't think he would have used that famous phrasing had he known that Anderson was going to say it, right? So I'm not making that argument. The argument I'm making is that Lincoln is using this moment, as he does over and over again, in context. He knows Anderson very well. He's met him on at least 3 occasions that I know of. He's a strong Union man. He's the right guy to deliver this message of let's get back and win this war. And he has an advanced copy of Everett's speech. So there certainly is collaboration. I don't want to use the word collusion these days, but there is certainly collaboration between Lincoln and Everett. There's no evidence of collaboration between Anderson. The other thing you should know is that the Lincoln administration does not really have any considerable impact or influence in planning this event. This event is planned by, and I'm talking about the dedication, is planned by Gary Wills and the loyal governors. So David Todd and the Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania and the Governor of New York. So those are the people that are planning this event. So there is Lincoln, as usual, and he's up the night before. He's even changing the speech in the morning of his address. He is taking this opportunity to do what he does so well. He knows what Everett's purpose is. He knows what Anderson's going to do, and he inspires his audience in that way. So that's the argument. I'm making a contextual argument, not a collaborative argument here for that, because there was no evidence of collaboration. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. In too many words, yes.
Unless I miss something, it seems like Anderson's original speech when he was whatever he was.
Yes.
He changed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for so how does a guy get up there in 1849 and argue that blacks are not genetically inferior, which is a really radical position, and then by 1865, after blacks have fought for the Union, he's arguing that they should not have the franchise. And how is that consistent? And the way that I parse that out in my own mind is that as Anderson feels like the franchise, and he writes. There's some really entertaining letters between him and William T. Sherman. They're quite close friends. And of course, Sherman is in the military. He can't really express his political opinions, but he sure expresses them to Anderson in these letters, which you'll find in the book. But Anderson and Sherman both feel like it would be a major mistake to give the franchise to the newly freed slaves, because not only would this turn the whole Southern political system topsy-turvy, which of course it did, but most of these freed slaves were illiterate. They had no idea of what voting was even about. So why do you give them this precious privilege of voting? Shouldn't they be educated first? Shouldn't there be a period where they are prepared to become full citizens? That was his argument. So in my mind, it really isn't he doesn't really change, but he certainly, as he gets older, he adopts this more Southern perspective, particularly in light of what he sees going on with the radicals in the U.S. Congress not following through on Lincoln's vision. When Lincoln's vision was very much of a vision that he would not over-penalize the South, right? So, and then Lincoln gets assassinated, and all of a sudden all bets are off. The radicals are running the Congress, and they're imposing martial law in the South. And the Southerners are, like Anderson, who is a Southerner, is none too happy about that. So, yes, sir.
Okay.
Follow-up question.
So, how does he become someone with a Southern perspective after he's been run out of the South and damn near lynched?
Yeah, I mean, I think in any of these situations you have to you can't really think of it as a either or, right? So it's not a Southern perspective or a Northern perspective. He has kind of a unique perspective, right? Because he's raised in the South on a slave plantation, yet he spends most of his adult life in the North. So if you look at people's attitudes toward their politics or their attitudes towards race in this period, it's I think beneficial to think of it as a spectrum, right? So they weren't just all abolitionists on one side and fire eaters on the other side. There were so many different gradations. I think more so than today, right? Today we seem to be polarized, but at that time there were a lot of different positions, and you could be an independent thinker. When Henry Clay died, after Henry Clay died in 1858, 1852. He never joined a political party after that. So he would pick and choose based on his conscience which way he would go. And like you heard, he isn't even going out and stumping for the other Union Party candidates. He thinks party politics is, that's why he's such a terrible politician. Yeah. Other questions here? All right. All right, well, thank you so much.